Welcome to week 3 of MPAI 600 here at Georgetown University. Just start off with announcements. Again, your collection strategies should be due now, with the exception of the 1s and 2s that I gave exceptions for. But now, yesterday, whenever you're done, I should have those back to you by next week. There might be a little bit of delay, but early next week or not. And I want to kind of also critique your writing. And I'm not saying critique in a negative way. We all could use improvement in our writing, and you'll see those comments on the collection strategy. Make sure that you, again, don't take offense to those. That's just my thoughts, and just incorporate those into future writing assignments. So current events, I don't. Obviously, what's making the news besides the COVID-19 is the killing in Minneapolis and the subsequent protests and riots that we've seen coming forward. I don't want to delve too much into it. The only thing I'll just say is that we all have biases, and that's one lesson that I'm trying to apply from this week. We all have biases. We have biases in our intel, whether we're intel analysts, whether we're police, whether just people seeing on the streets. And the key is not to say that we don't have biases or we don't see color or we don't see these things. That's not what we're trying to do. Everyone will make a judgment on it, but it's to understand when you're having these biases and are you falling into a bias trap. And that's what I'll say about the event. I don't want to get too political and wade too deep into it, but just that's kind of a lesson for many of you are in law enforcement and future intel folks going forward. The second thing I'll also say from a more practical perspective is when we're looking at some of these events, there will be an open source intelligence course, and one of the things will be to determine is, can you determine when you have one of these events, is it peaceful protests or are these going to turn into more violent aspects, or people from the outside coming in, as people are reporting now, to do more than just protest, but to engage in violent activity. And that's can be found using open source methods, social media intelligence, and other facets that can actually drive decisions by local law enforcement. That's the whole point of this course. The whole really point of this program is for intelligence to drive decisions to make operations a lot better and reduce risk. One example I go back to is Charlottesville in 2017. For those who don't remember, that was it was protests from the Lee Rex from the Fort Lee or Robert E. Lee statue being taken down. And the Charlottesville police thought it was just going to be protests, that it's going to be, I call them the white-collar racists, for lack of a better term, the preppy fraternity brother racists. And they did not realize that hardcore racists with guns and all those things were going to come in, and they were not prepared for it. Ironically, a journalist, did do the open source research, looked at Facebook, looked at all these websites for right-wing extremists and others, and determined, the people that are coming into Charlottesville are bad people. And people are going to be carrying guns and people who are engaged in violence before. Let's go cover it, because we know there's going to be something coming up. So journalists were able to use open source intelligence, but the Virginia Fusion Center, the Charlottesville police were not able to do that. And hopefully we've corrected from that. Hopefully you can learn something from that when you see these protests, we have to determine, again, using social media and open source, okay, who are the protests, who are legitimate, and are bad actors coming in that we need to be better prepared for. And that's something to, again, take away from what you're seeing in the news. So review of last week, again, requirements, which fed your collection strategy. Hopefully you've integrated them into the collection plan, and we can have, I'll see what you have going forward. And then we talked about intelligence traps quite significantly. You saw it in the reading, and then I talked in the lecture, and you saw it in the case study. So again, the key, confirmation bias, where we set on a first a first-person issue, and then all the information that we get tries to confirm that first assessment, no matter how wrong it is. That is a very, very typical trap that we see in not just in the case study, but in other intelligence scenarios, and we'll explore those in detail in the rest of the class. Mirror imaging. We assume an actor is going to act in the same way. We assume a foreign actor, or even a domestic actor, has our same incentive structure, has our same value system, and we assume they're going to act in certain ways based on what we perceive. We do that all the time. Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, we assumed he was a horrible, tyrannical person because he was killing a lot of the senior leadership around him in North Korea when he first took control. We don't understand that for him, it's a blood sport. It's a kill or be killed kind of action. If he didn't do it, one of those people might be gunning for him. They don't have peaceful transitions of power in these dictatorships. But we look at him through a lens, through our lens a lot of the times, and I think we're off in that respect. Other leaders like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, for a U.S. president, if he doesn't do well, he gets knocked off in the next election. For someone like Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, if he doesn't do well, he gets killed. Just like previous Chinese leader and previous Russian and Soviet leaders have. That's in the back of their mind going forward. I don't think we realize that when we're looking at these leaders. So just, again, an example of mirror imaging that people commonly do. And then you saw in the documentary, The Confessions, classic confirmation bias. You saw that they settled on one theory of the case, and they took it to a ridiculous level. They settled on one theory of the case. They tried to confirm it, every single piece of evidence. If they couldn't get it, they would essentially beat a confession, although they didn't use physical violence. This is really classic confirmation bias. Taken out to the 10th degree. A vividness bias. Those confessions, and Detective Ford understood that, those confessions would reign well in front of a jury. You could talk about DNA, you could talk about motive, you could talk about any of these abstract things. That doesn't hold a candle to someone confessing to the crime in their own voice. Even though confessions can sometimes be bogus, as you've seen before. In fact, 25 to 30% of all confessions are bogus for one reason or another. But they play well in front of a jury. In addition, the pictures of the victim being slaughtered in his way, that sets the jury to blame the guy who is brought up on charges. Even though that has nothing to do. You just see a blurry... not blurry, but a vivid picture of someone who's killed in a brutal way. You're going to take it out on the guy sitting there, even though that doesn't prove that the guy brought up on charges is guilty of that crime. That's called prejudicing the jury. Most courts don't allow it, some do, but that's an example of vividness bias. Clientelism. In this case, Detective Ford was under enormous pressure to get a conviction. They did not want a guy out there who was a killer to be roaming around Virginia Beach, and there was enormous pressure to get someone behind bars. That pressure forced evidence that had no business being used to arrest people. That happens in the intelligence community a lot. Happens when you get too close to your bosses, or there's enormous pressure on you to get a decision one way or another. That's essentially clientelism. And then finally, a couple of things, Georgetown values. And you'll probably see a couple of emails about SCS values and Georgetown values based on what we've seen recently. They try and instill a sense of justice in this course. And I don't know if anyone here is Catholic or Jesuit or religious or really cares. But they do try, in this course and in other courses, a sense of fairness, justice, and to impose those lessons on you. this is an example of a gross injustice. 4 people essentially lost the prime years of their lives because of this injustice. And it wasn't just a dirty cop. It was a cop. It was judges. It was juries. It was appellate judges. It was all the way up to the governor's office. All of them didn't exude a sense of justice in this case that could have been incorporated earlier. And just FYI, the civil suit of this court, the final civil suit between the city of Norfolk and these 4, was not settled till last year, the end of 2018. So it took 20 years to get justice in this case. And then finally, I had a student bring this up, and it's relevant to what we're seeing in Minneapolis. Evil versus bias. And it was summed up that good people have biases. Good people have biases. But this wasn't a guy, Detective Ford specifically, was not a guy who had biases. He had evil in his heart. He wanted to railroad these kids because he was just an evil person and didn't care about the end state. And he wasn't suffering from some bias or something that was psychologically in his head. He was just an evil person. That is one perspective. It's an interesting perspective. I don't necessarily agree with it, and it probably tells what I think about human nature, because I do think we could all be Detective Fords. Given the right circumstances, given the right the varied experiences, we could all be in a position, given the certain pressures, that we want to railroad these 4 kids. I mean, the people that put the Iraq WMD portfolios together were all good people, but they essentially blew intelligence in a large scale. Could we be that guy, the police officer in Minneapolis? I don't know. Easy for me to say that, of course we wouldn't act that way, but I have maybe a more craven view of human nature, that given in the right circumstances, we could all do that. I don't have an answer for that, but just a different perspective. So moving on to week 3, again, 2 case studies. Strategic surprise is the theme. Pearl Harbor and the Yom Kippur War. Most people are probably familiar with Pearl Harbor. The Yom Kippur War was an intelligence failure by the Israelis in 1973. But they didn't realize that their enemies were attacking them until they actually were attacking them. That was considered a pretty significant intelligence failure. And as you do the readings, look at what were the failures. Where did the failure in the chain occur? Was it in the collection phase? Was it in the analysis? Was it when the analysis briefed to the policymakers? Did the policymakers have the information, but they just failed to act? And or were there underlying circumstances where there's just bad luck happened? Think that through before when you're going through this week's readings. And then the documentaries and readings, The Doll, Intelligence and Surprise Attack. Hopefully you all have at least a downloaded version of that book. And I talk Pearl Harbor in detail. Yom Kippur War, the Riddell article, which covers in detail. And then the Al Jazeera, The Crossing. It's an hour-long documentary, very good documentary, but really the first 25 minutes or so cover the issue in detail. So I look forward to this week's discussion. I'll have your collection strategies back to you in a week, maybe a little bit more. And if there's questions or issues, let me know.